See everyone this morning. So hopefully everyone's enjoying the weather. I know it's a little chilly in the morning, but it is absolutely gorgeous in the afternoons. And so it is just a beautiful time of year. So anyway, if you have your Bible, turn to John chapter number 19. John chapter number 19. And last week we were in John chapter number 18, and we were looking at Jesus before Pilate. And obviously we've looked through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we were in John. And we were looking at Jesus before Pilate, and I know that, I mentioned it last week, but how that a lot of the other Gospels, when you read them, it makes it look like Jesus, basically didn't defend himself at all. And technically he didn't defend himself, but there was a conversation that was had between Jesus and Pilate. And so in John chapter 18, we looked at the conversation that Jesus had with Pilate, and in verse 36, Jesus told him, "My kingdom is not of this world." And so Pilate asked him, he said, "Are you a king? Are you a king?" And Jesus said, "Hey, my kingdom is not of this world." And Pilate asked him again, he said, "Art thou a king?" Then Jesus answered and said, "Thou sayest that I'm a king." And so he explained to him, and it gets to the point where it says, if you remember, that Jesus tells him that everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice, and Pilate saith unto him, "What is truth?" And so, but then Pilate goes out immediately. He goes out immediately and tells the Jews, he said, "I find no fault in him. I find no fault in him at all." And so we got to chapter number 19. We actually got to the first verse in chapter 19 last week. "Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him." And we talked about how that it's an interesting thing here that what Pilate did, because, Pilate is punishing an innocent man. And we know that he's going to consent to crucify an innocent man. We understand that. But Pilate is punishing an innocent man. And I believe that Pilate was attempting to scourge Jesus in the hopes and in the effort that it would satisfy the Jews just to see him punished. And it would satisfy the Jews, but he did not understand the hunger and the lust that they had in their heart to see Jesus slain. He didn't understand that. He did not understand. He should have, because if you remember, they brought him to him and they said he's a malefactor. In verse number 30, in chapter 18, they answered and said unto him, "If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee." And so he's like, he said, "Take him and judge him according to your law." And they said, "No, we can't put a man to death." In verse number 31, it says, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." Now we understand under Jewish law they could stone someone, but because they were under the Romans, they couldn't put Jesus to death legally, even though they tried multiple times before, had the desire to multiple times before. But now they want to do that. They want to do it, and they're trying to do it under the guise of being legal, and so they're going to have Pilate do it. And so I just thought about that. I don't know that you could ever describe. Brother Parks, as you read and you study this, you can't help but read all the passages and read this passage, and then you just have to go on over into Jesus suffering on the cross. And I don't think I could ever even attempt to do justice to how the things that Jesus had to suffer for my sin and your sin. And so, but you think about that scourging. You think the men that scourged him were professional at what they did. They were professional at what they did, and I don't think necessarily because they were Romans. I don't think they had hate in their heart like the Jews had hate in their heart, but they were professional at what they did. And they were very good at what they did. And once Pilate gave the order to scourge Jesus, they took it upon themselves to do a really good job. And so you can imagine Jesus there and his bare back being exposed. And as they whipped him, and the Jews were only allowed, I think, 40 lashes. But the Romans weren't bound to that. And so there's no telling how many times Jesus took that whip and took that whip and received those stripes from those Roman soldiers. And no doubt whenever they were done, his beaten and battered and bruised body would just been a terrible thing to look at. It would have been a terrible thing to look at. I mean, if you've ever, and I know we're live here, but if you've ever whipped your child too hard, and no one has to shake their head because we're live here, but if you've ever whipped your child too hard, and you're like, oh man, a little rough right there that time. A little rough right there right that time. I know my father-in-law used to talk about how when his mom would take a switch and that thing, she'd get a long one, and that thing would wrap around him. He said he'd look like a barber pole whenever she got done because it was white legs and the red stripes coming up his leg. And you're like, whoo, I'll tell you what, little rough right there that time. But you imagine these people, they had no mercy. They had no pity. They had no care. It wasn't, I mean, again, when you whip your child, when you correct your child, that's what you're doing. You're attempting to correct your child. You're not trying to hurt them. You're just trying to punish them and get them to understand that, hey, if I do this again, it's going to hurt worse the next time. Hey, I need to learn this thing. I need to learn this so you don't spare the rod. And so, but here these men, they had no mercy. They had no love for Jesus. They only had a job to do, and they did it. They did their job to the best of their abilities. And just imagine what Jesus. And again, like I said, as you read these passages, I try to put myself there. I try to put myself in the crowd there and see what they saw and feel what they felt and imagine seeing Jesus after he's been scourged. And so in verse number 2 it says, and the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. And we know from our previous study how that they were mocking him, they were spitting on him, they were plucking out his beard, they were doing all those things. Why? Because they didn't care. They didn't care. Pilate said it. He said, "Am I a Jew?" He said, "Am I a Jew? I'm not a Jew. This is a Jewish problem. This is a religious problem. This is not a matter of something that I even need to be involved in." But they made him involved because, again, they changed their accusation. They changed their accusation from blasphemy, which is what they tried him under whenever they tried him before the Sanhedrin, to now they told Pilate, they said, well, he says he's a king. He says that he's forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, which we know that was a false accusation. And so here the soldiers, they mock him and they make fun of him and they plat this crown of thorns, and you just imagine. I mean, we mow yards on the side, and whenever I mow yards, a lot of the places that we mow are right against just some overgrown brush and stuff like that. And Brother Parks, I mean, every once in a while you get in some of them sawbriars, you get to ripping through there, and them things get a hold of you and they don't let go. They don't let go, and sometimes they'll get me on the ear. They'll get me on the ears I ride by, and they'll get me on the head. Sometimes they'll get me on the arm, and you try and see them, you try and avoid them, but sometimes you just can't. And them things will tear you up. But I mean that pales in comparison to what these Roman soldiers did to Jesus. You can imagine those thorns, and when they put that crown of thorns on his head, they didn't just set that thing on there lightly. I think they smacked that thing into his head, and you can imagine as those thorns poked into his head, and anyone that's ever bled from the face understands how much blood comes out from just the slightest little wound on your face. Just the slightest little wound. I mean, can you imagine what Jesus looked like after he'd been scourged, and after they put that crown of thorns and that blood is running down his face? And so in verse number 3, in verse number 4, Pilate therefore went forth again and saith unto him, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. And so here he is again, like I said, over and over and over. Between Pilate and Herod, multiple times they said, there's no fault in him. There's no fault in him. If you remember, I believe it was in Luke, but it might not have been, where Pilate was frustrated with him, and he's like, Why? Why? What evil hath he done? Because he was so frustrated because he didn't understand. He didn't understand why they were so insistent that Jesus be crucified when he'd never done anything but good. And so now Pilate brings him out, and I think, like I said, Pilate was looking for an out. We know from Acts, we know from the book of Acts where Peter was talking, and he says that Pilate was determined to let him go. He was determined to let him go. And so here we have him, and he brings him out again. Like I said, I'm firmly convinced that he scourged him in an effort to say, okay, I don't understand all your Jewish laws. I don't understand all your Jewish customs. I don't understand all your Jewish things, but I'm going to throw y'all a bone here. And even though I find no fault in him at all, I'm going to punish him. I'm going to punish him, by scourging him. And then, again, like I said, just the shame and humility of it all. You're not going to get over the fact that you've been scourged, publicly scourged. And so Pilate thought, well, that'll be enough. Well, guess what? The Jews could have scourged him. They already told him. They already said, again, in verse number 31, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. They already said, this is what we want. And so Pilate thought, well, scourging's going to be enough, but sometimes you just don't listen. If y'all are listening to what's going on over in Israel right now, and I don't necessarily recommend listening to him all the time, but listening to Ben Shapiro about what's going on over there, over in Israel right now, and with Hamas, and he's like, look, guys, Hamas is not even hiding the ball. They're telling you exactly what they want. They want the end of Israel. They want from the river to the sea. It means they want them destroyed, and they're not even hiding the ball. But people over here are like, well, we know what they said, but that they didn't really mean exactly what they said. No, they meant exactly what they said. They meant exactly what they said. They want all Jews killed, and they want that land back. And so here Pilate didn't understand, even though they said it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. Pilate's like, well, maybe they didn't really want to put to death. Maybe if we just make a public mockery over him, maybe if we just punish him publicly where people can see, and maybe that'll be enough. It was not ever going to be enough. It was not ever going to be enough. So he brings him out again and says, I find no fault in him. And yet here he is. He's been punished. And he's like, all right, this is going to get me out of this. And I was reading in Matthew Henry. And Matthew Henry made a statement. And I thought how appropriate it was for this statement. Pilate was having a struggle between his convictions and his corruptions. And so I read that, and Chris, you're shaking your head, but I thought about this. I mean, here, how many times does Pilate say, I find no fault in him? He's the ruler. He's the one in charge. He's the one in charge. And so they brought Jesus to him. And Brother Parks, honestly, again, I mean, for me and you, if we think about it, we're like, hey, well, if I'm in charge, I'm in charge. And I'm just going to set my foot down and say, y'all need to back off. Y'all, I find no fault in this man. Y'all need to settle your little religious dispute and just get over it, because this man has done nothing wrong. But yet, like I said, Pilate had these convictions of, I find no fault in him. And I think he even had some sense of justice that, hey, this is wrong. We know from some of the other passages it said that Pilate that Pilate knew that the Jews had delivered him for envy, and so he understood. But yet he had these corruptions, and we're going to see that the Jews finally figured out the right words to say to get Pilate to finally say, all right, you can have him. You can have him. And so, like I said, you see this back and forth, not just with Peter, with Pilate and the Jews and Pilate and Jesus, but Pilate with himself. You can see Pilate with himself, and I thought about this, and I know that it's not a perfect example, but in the realm of convictions and corruptions, I thought about when a man's lost, because Pilate's about to say, let me get to this. Then came Jesus forth wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. And so Pilate brings him out, and he brings him out, and like I said, it's now a beaten and a battered body, Riley. It's a bruised body. It's a bloody body that they bring out. And there's this crown of thorns that he's got on his head, and blood running down his face. And like I said, they smote him with their hands. So again, like I said, I mean, if you've ever seen somebody in a fight before that's been smote with their hands, I mean, it'll turn blue pretty quick. And so here Jesus comes out, and Pilate said, "Behold the man." And I thought about in my own life how that there comes a point in time. There comes a point in time in everyone's life, not necessarily, not even just my own life, but everyone's life, whenever you're faced with Jesus. Pilate woke up that morning, and he did not realize, he did not have any idea when he woke up that morning that he was going to be face to face with, what am I going to do with Jesus? And when you're lost, eventually, sometime in your life, you're going to hear the preaching, you're going to hear the gospel, and you're going to be faced with the fact, what am I going to do with Jesus? And Chris, there's a struggle that goes on. There's a struggle between these convictions that you're feeling from the Holy Ghost, these convictions that the preaching that you're hearing is right, these convictions that what this man is saying is right, these convictions and what the Holy Ghost is saying to you inside is right, that I'm a sinner and I need a Savior. And then there's these corruptions that you have, Brother Parks. And there's these corruptions that you have. These things, if you remember my testimony, I was 7th, 8th grade, so probably 13 years old. And I had a boy, we were sitting in computer class. It's amazing the things that you can still visualize in your mind from, I mean, what are we talking, 33 years ago? 33 years ago, I can still see myself sitting in the computer class, sitting in front of them computer screens, and this boy that I know witnessing to me and telling me I ought to get saved. And I remember telling him, Brother Wayne, I said, I know I should, but there's some things that I want to do first. What was that? That was corruption inside of me. That was corruption inside of me. And I was faced with, what am I going to do with this man? What am I going to do with Jesus? What am I going to do? Am I going to give in to these convictions and say, I need to treat this man right? If you're lost, I need to get saved. Or am I going to give in to my corruption and say, not today, not today, not today? Not today. I've got these things. I've got these things. And I remember my father-in-law talking about how sometimes he would talk to someone, witness to someone, and they say, well, if I get saved, am I going to have to give up this? You are now. You are now. There's not necessarily this list of things you have to give up and things that you don't have to give up. But whenever you put it as this is the thing I'm not willing to give up, guess what? That's the thing you're going to have to give up. That's what you're going to have to give up. And so you're faced with these convictions and these corruptions, and you have to choose. And how many times as a lost person, did you sit there and you choose your corruptions? And how many times was God good to you and came back again and again and again and make you that offer again? And so Pilate brings it forth, and he says, behold the man. And I know in Pilate's heart, in Pilate's mind, he's like, please. Again, like he said, put yourself there. Put yourself in Pilate's shoes. Put yourself in his shoes right here. And he's like, I didn't want to deal with this. Again, have you ever just had to deal with something, whether you're a boss at work or something like that, and something comes up, and it's like, guys, can y'all not just settle this? Can we not just, I don't really want to deal with this. Could this not have been settled? But okay, if you want me to do, all right, I'm going to do it. And so he thought, please, 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 let this be enough. Let this be enough. Verse number 6, when the chief priests, therefore, and officers saw him, they cried out. Not just, no, crucify him. They cried out. And we know that the chief priests and the officers, they weren't just doing that for themselves. They were stirring up the crowd. They were stirring up the crowd. They were whipping up the crowd into a frenzy. And so when the chief priests, therefore, and officers saw it, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Again, like I said, Pilate, he wanted done with this. He wanted done with this. And he thought by scourging Jesus, he could be done with that. But he didn't understand. And so now, here are the chief priests. They start the people, and they're like, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate's like, fine. Take ye him and crucify him. Again, this is such a contradictory term. Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. He said, you take him and you crucify him. If you remember, he washes his hands in one passage where he washes his hands. He says, I'm innocent. Now, I don't believe he was. I don't believe he was. And we know that Jesus is about to tell him that the ones that basically turned him over, the ones that brought him to him, they had the greater sin. But that he didn't say, Pilate, you're gonna be faultless in this. That's not what he said. He's about to tell him that they have the greater sin, but he didn't say, Pilate, you don't have any sin. And so Pilate says, you take him. I want this off of me, and I want this on you. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Now, he didn't make himself the Son of God. He was the Son of God. He always was the Son of God. He'll always be the Son of God. Contrary to many religions, many false religions today that deny who Jesus truly was, they deny that Jesus was God and always was God. Some of them teach that he because of what he did, he worked himself up into a place of being a God. But that's not what it was. Jesus didn't make himself God. He always was God. He always was the Son of God. Verse number 8, it says, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. If you look in Matthew chapter number 27, you're going to see that Pilate's wife came to him. Let me read verse 18 just to go back to the convictions and corruptions thing. For he knew, not he thought, Not, well, it might have been. Not, well, it could be. Not, maybe. Maybe not, there's a chance. Not, there's a slight chance. For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. He knew this was a religious dispute, and this was nothing more than jealousy for the fact that Jesus, the crowd was beginning to follow Jesus and turn away from the old Jewish religion into following Jesus, following Christ, and for envy they delivered him. Verse 19, when he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife said unto him, saying, have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. So Pilate's wife said, hey, look, she's like, I've suffered many things. We've already looked at this. But Pilate already had this, he already had this fear that had already come up inside of him that. And again, we've all been in this situation. You ever been in a situation where you just don't feel right about it? You're just concerned. You're just fearing. You're just concerned. And so here's Pilate, and he just doesn't feel right. And then they say that he made himself the Son of God. And Pilate's like, whoa, wait a second here. I didn't realize what I was dealing with here. I did not realize what I was dealing with here. First they said he was a king, and then I talked to him, and I didn't really understand, and then he mentioned something about truth, and I asked him what is truth, but I didn't take the time to hear the answer of what truth was. But now they just said that he made himself the Son of God, and just in my short time with him, in my short time of examining him, that I understand there's something different about this man. There's something different about this man, because no man that I've ever judged before that was as innocent as this man would be willing to go suffer on the cross like this man. This man is willing to go to the cross. Pilate's like, I've tried to trade Jesus. I've tried to make them make the decision. Would you rather have Jesus or Barabbas? I've tried to get out of it that way, and then I've scourged him, and I've tried to get out of it that way. And the Jews aren't having any of it. And this man seems to be just as willing, as a sheep to the slaughter. This man is just willing to go to the cross. And Pilate didn't understand. So in verse number 9 it says, went in again into the judgment hall and saith unto Jesus, whence art thou? He said, Pilate asked him, he said, where do you come from? Whence art thou? He's like, where do you come from? And here is where, in verse number 9, but Jesus gave him no answer. Again, like I said, I feel, as I've studied this out over the last several weeks, I do feel some sympathy for Pilate, because he was in a no-win situation. Jesus was going to the cross. He was going to the cross. He was going to die on that cross. He told Nicodemus all the way back in John chapter number 3, if I be lifted up. He'd already told him. He's going. He told his disciples. He told his disciples in Matthew chapter 20, in Mark chapter 10, and Luke chapter number 18. He told them. He said, "I'm going to go. I'm going to be scourged. I'm going to be punished by the Gentiles, and I'm going to the cross." And so he was going to the cross, and here's Pilate, and he's stuck between this rock and a hard place. And stuck between, again, back to his convictions of this man's an innocent man. There's no fault in this man. And his corruptions of, I'm over these people, and I got to keep these people happy, because if they go to Rome and if they stir up enough of a stink, I'm going to lose my position. And so he went into the hall, and he goes in, and I feel like in my heart, he was like, please, Jesus, get me out of this. Please get me out of this. Just say something. Say something that I can go back to them and say, no, we're not crucifying him. We're not crucifying him. And so he went into the hall, and he goes in, and I feel like in my heart, he was like, please, Jesus, get me out of this. Please get me out of this. Just say something that I can go back to them and say, no, we're not crucifying him. We're not crucifying him. But Jesus was determined to go to the cross. Jesus was determined to bear my sin and your sin in his body on the tree. And he wasn't going to give Pilate that out. He wasn't giving him that out. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? He was amazed. It says he marveled. He marveled. He was just shocked. He's like, I don't understand. I've never had someone before me that was standing before me as innocent as this man and refused to defend himself. Refused. Would not defend himself. He said, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and have power to release thee? And so Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me. A lot of, have you ever seen someone, we called it at work, some people have the Napoleon syndrome, where they're little bitty short, they're little short people, and because they're short, they have to, have this big attitude to make up for the fact that they feel inferior because they're short, or you work under a boss and he's just not confident in himself and so because of that he has to be really aggressive. He has to be aggressive to people, and you're like, dude, you're the boss. All you gotta do is just say this is what you want done, and we'll do it. But then anytime someone says the least little thing, he feels like it's a challenge to him, and he's like, Rah! And you're like, man, I was just asking a question. Like, calm down here. And so Pilate took this quite well. He took this quite well. Because Jesus said, you don't have any power. Here's a man that's been scourged. Here's a man that's been beaten. Here's a man that's wearing a crown of thorns and blood running down his face. And Pilate says, don't you understand? I have power. I can have you killed, or I can have you released. And this man that sat there, again, like a sheep to the slaughter, that sat there and not defending himself, Pilate says, I have this power. And this man all of a sudden says, you don't have that power. You don't have that power. You're not that powerful. Understand, Pilate, you're not that powerful. He said, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Now, if you remember, he feared because he said he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Pilate's like, oh, that made him more afraid. Pilate knew who he was talking about. Again, Pilate was a pagan. He didn't understand the Jewish religion. He didn't understand Jehovah. He didn't understand any of that stuff. But he understood. He understood. And so Jesus says, look, he said, you don't have that power. He said, except that we're giving you, he said, you wouldn't have power at all. Pilate was impressed with Jesus. Again, his conviction was he was impressed with him. And so he tried to get out of it with Herod. He tried to get out of it with trading Jesus for Barabbas. He tried to get out of it with the scourging. And now here he is, and he's talking to Jesus, and Jesus said, you don't have any power at all. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Not the sin, but the greater sin. Now, Brother Parks, maybe you could expound this on me. Some people think they're talking about Judas right there. And I think, but I think you should also put Caiaphas in there. And those Jews. And we know from the book of Acts, when Peter's preaching and Peter's talking to them, they're going to be like, oh, wait a second, you're going to put the blood of this man on our hands. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Because if you remember from our previous study, they said his blood be upon us and on our children. But in the book of Acts, they're like, well, wait a second, you're going to put his blood on us. Well, yeah, you made the bargain. You made the bargain. You told Pilate that whenever Pilate washed his hands, he's like, okay, I'm washing my hands. And they're like, his blood will be on us and on our children. Because they thought they were going to be done with Jesus. They thought crucifying him would end it. They thought crucifying him would end Jesus. They thought crucifying him would scatter those disciples and scatter them out, and they would be ashamed and never pick their head up again. They didn't have any idea who they were truly dealing with. In verse number 12, it says, and from thenceforth, Pilate sought to release him. Again, in my mind, I'm like, you're in charge. If you really saw it, you're in charge. You'd be like, look, I'm releasing him. Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. And so here we go. Here in the beginning of the verse, Pilate sought to release him. That was his conviction. But the Jews said, we know. Here's our trump card. Here's our trump card. All these Roman governors knew they were always on shaky ground. They were always on shaky ground. Caesar was he was very fickle. He was very easily persuaded. And from my understanding, I don't have it written down, but from my understanding, someone that had helped get Pilate to this position had been taken out just like a year or two before. So now Pilate's here on his own. He doesn't have someone that can go to Caesar and defend him. And now he's on his own, and he's dealing with these Jews. And the Jews, their favorite tactic was to go to Rome and make these accusations. Again, we know from Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin and Jesus' trial before Pilate that they didn't have any qualms with making false accusations. They didn't care. And so they say, he said, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. They're like, okay, Pilate, if you won't deal with this, if you refuse to deal with this, we're going to go to Caesar and say, there's this man Jesus, and he's claiming to be king over Judea, and that you're not king over Judea anymore. And Pilate, with his corruption, said, oh, they would do that. They would do that. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and it saith unto the Jews, behold, not the man, behold your king. I think Pilate was convinced that Jesus was who he said he was. I think even Pilate was convinced that Jesus was a king, and he was their king. You're going to see it later in just a few verses. In verse 19, Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And he didn't just write it in one language, Chris. He wrote it in 3 languages. He wrote it so everyone there, anyone that walked by that cross while Jesus was hanging on that cross, whether Hebrew or Greek or Latin, whatever language you could read, whatever words you could read in that language, you were going to know that was Jesus, the King of the Jews. And I believe Pilate was convinced, but his corruptions overcame his convictions. You show me a lost man that's set in a church service where there's a heavy spirit of conviction and he walks out lost, guess what? His corruptions overcame his convictions. Tell me a time in your life where you were under conviction and you said no, and tell me why. And I'll guarantee you can tell me a corruption that you said, if I do this, I'll have to stop doing that. I'll have to change this. I'll have to quit hanging out with this person. I'll have to give up this. And you'd rather have your corruptions than your convictions. And so Pilate brings Jesus out and he says, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Again, I mean, I guess, you know, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine how they've sat there and they've lied and they violated the law of God in accusing Jesus of what they accused him of. And they sent him to Pilate, and Pilate was determined to let him go. And Herod examined him, and Herod said, I find no fault in him. And Pilate examined him again and said, I've examined him again, and I find no fault in him at all. At all. Not even in what y'all have accused him of. I haven't found any fault in him whatsoever. And they said, crucify him anyway. We don't care. Crucify him. Let us be done with this man. Let us be finished with this man. If you would just crucify him, we could go back to our houses and live in peace and be happy. And they had no idea. They had no idea. They had no idea that it was not going to be the end. It was just the beginning. Because Jesus had to go to the cross. And 3 days later, he had to rise from the dead. And they had no idea, Chris. They thought, if we just get him killed, all our problems will be over. If we can just get him on that cross and get him killed, and then all our problems will be over. And they said, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to him, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, and this was a lie. This was a lie. The chief priests, had Jesus come as what they thought the Messiah was, and come as a conquering king, and come and put the government on his shoulders and took away the oppression that they were under, had he come that way, they would have celebrated him. They weren't happy being under Caesar. They weren't thrilled being under Caesar. They hated being under Caesar. The chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. It was a lie, Chris. They hated it. But it was a means to an end. Verse 16, then delivered he him therefore unto them. It looks a little strange to me, because I think my understanding is normally he would have been delivered directly to the Romans, and the Romans would have took him and crucified him. But it says, then delivered he therefore unto them. Like he was delivered to the Jews. He's like, y'all are not getting out of this. Y'all will not get out of this. I'm delivering him to you, and y'all are going to be the ones that he again, if you remember, he washed his hands and said, and they said, his blood's on us. Pilate's like, no, it's not just the Romans going to take him up and crucify him. Y'all are responsible for this. So I'm delivering him to you. And you are going to be the ones that are going to have to be responsible for his blood. And they took Jesus and led him away. Next week we'll get in. We'll move further. But Jesus witnessed. He witnessed. He before Pilate. Like I said, I believe that Pilate was convinced by the time he didn't even know who Jesus was necessarily. Whenever he first met Jesus, now Herod did. Herod had heard of him. Herod wanted him to do a miracle. But I don't think Pilate really understood who Jesus was. But I think by the time Pilate got done examining Jesus, I think he knew. I I think he knew in his heart that it was the Son of God. And he allowed them to crucify the Son of God. Thank you.